So I was watching this new Jordan Peterson video, the Logos at Ephesus. It's kind of a lecture that he was presenting at Ephesus on, it was really pretty good, actually. Jordan Peterson, either consciously or unconsciously, is working on, in the process of working out, a really potentially very powerful argument for the existence of God. It's kind of what has been slowly turning him into a Christian all these years. That's sort of a values-based, even close to a precept argument. It's kind of like a values-based, God is the structure, God is the top of the value in a hierarchy of structure of a hierarchy of values, and all societies need to be predicated on a structure of values if they are to be coherent societies. And I say precept because ultimately it's going to be predicated on the impossibility of the contrary. In other words, something along the lines of, this isn't the point of the video, this is a quick aside about something that has long been generating in Peterson's consciousness as he analyzes religion and society, is that God is this is what that Alex, the last video I produced with Cosmic Skeptic analyzing Jordan Peterson, there was some of this in there, where God is the top hierarchy in a structure of values. It's the top value in a structure of values, and in order for society or civilization to be coherent, it has to be predicated on a structure of values that is coherent. And I say precept because the impossibility of the contrary. If it isn't, the society will devolve and be incoherent, and ultimately, it looks to be like what's happening to our society right now. Turn into anarchy and chaos and lawlessness, and some would say it looks like where we're heading right here in the United States of America. But anyways, it's not the point of the video, so it's just a quick aside. If that didn't quite make all that much sense, I know what I meant. At some point, I'm going to be, elaborating on that in full, where Peterson's, he is kind of unconsciously working out a really potentially very powerful argument for the existence of God. I would call it a values-based argument for Christianity. You'll see more videos I'm making on the subject in months and weeks to come. So anyway, what was interesting about this video, it's a really, really pretty good lecture overall. I strongly recommend you check it out. Even you atheists will like it. There's a lot of good stuff in it. It's classic Peterson, seems to be a return to form. For a long time, Peterson has been a little bit off. He's been crying over nothing. And there's a lot of weird Peterson takes out there in the last couple of years. And this one is back to wow, this is really interesting and really potentially very powerful. And he brought up something that, the reason what I'm going to address in this video is he brought up something that I had addressed years ago in a video. He brought up Elvis Presley's guitar. Now, here is something, that I brought this up in a video a long time ago, and he brought it up sort of in the same context. If you are a reductionist materialist, okay, if you're an atheist, you are almost more than likely a reductionist materialist. And here is something that you need to consider, because I brought this argument up a long time ago, and I used the exact same example, Elvis Presley's guitar. Think about Elvis Presley's guitar, okay? The reason why if you're an atheist and you get all moist in the panties because you see, look, all these Christians are deconstructing from their religion. As I said, you should take it down a notch. Why? Because they are not becoming atheists. And if you properly analyze the argument, let's call it the argument from Elvis Presley's guitar, here's why: they will never become atheists. Because there is a spiritual component to life. Try as you might as an atheist to materially reduce it all to just matter and motion, the Elvis Presley guitar argument shows you that this is just never going to be the case. Well, what do I mean? Let's think about what is actually going on with Elvis Presley's guitar. Elvis Presley's guitar, it would be a mass-produced guitar, right? Indistinguishable from any other guitar except for the fact that it was once owned by Elvis Presley. So materially speaking, if you reduce it to just the material components of the guitar, it'd be identical I'm going to say Fender Strat. I don't think Elvis Presley actually played a Fender Strat. That was made famous by Jimi Hendrix, I believe. Well, I'm standing next to the mountain, put it all in the palm of my hand. And by the way, the best cover ever, I'll probably make a video about this, but the best cover of all time is easily, I would say, Jimi Hendrix, All Along the Watchtower. It is a cover of Bob Dylan's. I mean, it's just spectacular. I remember when I was young, the first time I heard it, I think I was in 9th grade, and I was hanging out at my sister's place at University of Pennsylvania. I went to visit her. And it wasn't the first time I'd smoked marijuana, but it was the first time I was like really, really, really baked. And I heard that song for the first time. It blew my mind. Literally blew me away. So, Fender Strat was made famous by Jimi Hendrix. I don't remember exactly what Elvis Presley used to play, but let's just say for argument's sake, it's a Fender Strat, just to keep the video simple. So, comes off the mass-produced by the assembly line is a Fender Stratocaster, indistinguishable from any other guitar. We could use the same argument, Jimi Hendrix, same idea. So it was one day, it was purchased by Elvis Presley, and it's one of the guitars that he had in his closet and he used all the time. Now, think about how our society would value that guitar versus any other guitar from that make and model. Identical make and model. If you went to a garage sale and you found the Elvis Presley guitar and you could establish the progeny, you know, that guitar would be worth, I would say, anywhere from 50 grand to $300,000. That's how much our society would value that guitar. And that's everybody. That would include almost every atheist. There's only one atheist I can think of who would probably still say, well, it's the exact same material as the other Fender Stratocaster, so I wouldn't even, it's not even worth anything. It's Deconverted Man. He's the only one. It's Deconverted Man. He's the only one. He's probably going to argue even in the comment section that, like, you know, it's completely worthless as opposed to, because materially speaking, he would be correct. Okay? I'm trying to show why most nones are never going to become atheists. Why? Because there's a spiritual component to life. If you think about why we would value Elvis's Presley guitar differently, it's literally because it was owned 50 years ago by Elvis Presley, which is an entirely spiritual thing. It has nothing to do with the material components of the guitar. Other than that, it'd be virtually indistinguishable from the same guitar, same make and model. If you went to a garage sale and you bought the same guitar owned by Joe Schmo from Tuckahoe, how much would it be? What, 20 bucks? It'd cost you 50 bucks. As opposed to anywhere north of $50,000, you would probably be valuing the Elvis Presley guitar at. Now, that's an entirely spiritual equation. Do you remember how atheists say we Christians, we spiritual people are not rational? Everybody in our society, everybody, except the atheists, would make that same spiritual equation. That's why it is worth that much. Because everybody would look at it differently. That's a totally spiritual thing. That is exactly what the Bible says when it talks about evidence of things not seen. You would be valuing that guitar entirely differently from any other guitar, same make and model, based on what? Based on the evidence of things not seen. Somebody would be like, wow, this was once owned by Elvis Presley. Deconverted Man is the only one I can think of who would say, so what? Everybody else would go, yeah, my God. Deconverted Man might buy it as a practical matter because it'd be worth a lot of money. But he's the only one I can think of who wouldn't value it internally any differently. Everybody else would. That's why it's worth so much. They would look at it differently. And they would look at it differently. What atheists argue is irrational is not irrational at all. Because everybody would do it. It's super rational to some degree. They would value it differently based on the fact that it was previously owned by Elvis Presley, which would be entirely non-material, spiritual information about the guitar. Something that, as the Bible says, the evidence of things not seen. You couldn't see Elvis Presley. Maybe you had a picture of him playing it. But other than that, you would be entirely valuing it off of what is in essence a spiritual idea. That Elvis transferred some sort of, there's something really, really deeply significant by virtue of the fact that Elvis owned. That's an entirely spiritual thing. And look at how hard it is to explain exactly what that would be. That's what I said. Religion. It is the ritualized connection to the ineffable. Hard to put into words. Try and think of and articulate exactly what the difference would be. It's hard to put it into words. But you could get someone to go like, oh my God, Elvis. It's got to be the guitar's like, whoa, and it's like cool, and it's like, oh my God, this is wow. Those would be the words. Those would be literally the words someone would use. And they'd pay north of $200,000 to buy the guitar from you. And if it was a fan of Elvis Presley, you might go as high as $350,000. You know, as a big committed fan of Elvis Presley, there are people who are more spiritual by nature. Generally speaking, they're a lot more sensitive to these type of things. So there are some people who would probably even ascribe talismanic power to the guitar, right? There are some people who would buy the guitar, put it over their mantelpiece, and try to like, you know, commune with it every time they wrote songs, hoping they were getting some type of transference. Now that might be a little too much. Most people wouldn't go in that direction. All atheists would go, well, that's nonsense. But do you understand as an atheist, this spiritual dimension that I am clearly showing you, okay? Everybody else, most people wouldn't go to the point where they would think that the guitar would impart some type of totemic or talismanic power to you. But everybody else would see a really, really big difference in significance just by virtue of the fact that it was owned by Elvis Presley. That's an entirely spiritual thing. And it's deeply rational. How do we know it's deeply rational? Because everybody would make that calculation, except Deacon Verman. Except Deacon Verman would do it. But everybody else would. All the other atheists would. Now, some atheists might look at it a little differently, have a sense of reverential awe about it. That is what religion is predicated on. That sense of reverential awe. One of the things I'm going to bring up in videos to come is there are the churches in Europe. You know, for the most part Catholic, but some of them are, one of the best ones is actually Cologne Cathedral. And I'm pretty sure that was Lutheran. It's spectacular. And what it was trying to do by the architecture was induce a sense of reverential awe in the person who walked into the building. And I've been there. It's successful. It worked. It works. Now that is a feeling that is heavily associated with spirituality and religion. But in the case of the Elvis Presley, it is a calculation, a values calculation that every single solitary person would make. Hence, deeply rational by definition. Something that everybody would do is even if you can't explain why that's rational, it is in essence, deeply rational. Why? Because it's common idea, common sense, normal, a completely logical calculation, even though it's hard to articulate what the difference would be for the guitar. Everyone in our society, including most atheists, would see a profound difference. That's completely spiritual, guys. It's exactly what the Bible's talking about when it says, and that's, keep in mind, this is one of the most like laughed at phrases in the Bible. The evidence of things not seen. Sounds like no evidence at all. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, in the case of the Elvis Presley guitar, is it no evidence at all? No. It's profound. It's the difference between a $50 guitar and a $50,000 guitar. Literally. That's a huge value difference. And everyone in our society would make that calculation, bar none, except Deacon Verman. Now, let's look at it a different way. So, give you another, in this video I made a long time ago, I put another example, same idea. The question is there something tangible, spiritual, that you could hold on to? There's obviously something that people think is highly significant. To some degree subjective, but not all that subjective. Why? Because that guitar would have a price. It would have a value. Somewhere between $50,000 and $300,000 is my guess. But would have a market value for sure. So it would have a tangible difference according to the market. That's a really big, important thing. Why? Because that's to some degree objective. Not arguable. Everybody would think there's a difference. Everybody. Now, here's another question where we can ask, is it something tangible? Let's take the example I used in the video from long ago. It's interesting because Jordan Peterson brought up the exact same example. And he was making a very similar argument about the nature of spirituality, how spirituality actually works. Okay? So I say listen to his lecture on Ephesus. It's a really good. It's Peterson back to his old form as far as I'm concerned. It's as good as anything I've ever heard by Jordan Peterson. And better than most of the stuff you've heard in the last 2 or 3 years. A lot better. Now, let's go to Auschwitz. All of you know Auschwitz, right? It's probably the most evil place in the history of the world. It's basically talked about a guitar being mass-produced. Here in America, we were mass-producing things like guitars and cars, fun, happy things. And there in Nazi Germany, they were mass-producing death. Quite literally. Quite literally. You got off the train at the selection. I don't know if you know the history of Auschwitz, but a trainload of people would show up and they'd instantly make a selection. This group, you go over there to be worked really hard, probably to death, and this group, you go over to the gas chambers to be killed immediately. And they would pick right then and there. Saw the movie Sophie's Choice? My wife was asking about Sophie's Choice yesterday. That's actually the choice in Sophie's Choice, just to give up one of her kids. Now, Auschwitz is possibly the most evil place in the history of the world. I can't think of any place worse. I really can't, actually. Probably Auschwitz would be. Now, there are people, and my wife would be one of them, and one of the differences between someone who considers themselves spiritual and someone who doesn't is, to some degree, sensitivity. My wife is a really sensitive person. She would never, ever, ever, in a million years, I could never get her to go to Auschwitz. Ever. Ever. Why? Because she'd be too sensitive to it. She'd just freak out and be triggered out just by walking around on the ground. Matter of fact, she'd be so sensitive to it, if I somehow even convinced her, got her on a train to Auschwitz, and we were in Poland heading towards it, about a mile away, she would freak out and start throwing up and couldn't go through with it. And it would be to some degree real things. She would, if we were actually at Auschwitz, she'd see like a bullet hole in the wall and have some sort of, really vivid sense of what happened with that bullet, with that gunfire. So to some degree, her violent emotional reaction to the place is predicated on reality. It's certainly predicated on the events that transpired there between the years of 42 and 45. Okay, so it's certainly predicated on that. But the question is, would there be a tangible presence of evil to the place? Almost every theist type person would say yes. If you're a Christian, you would say yes too. You might not know that. The Bible says even the rocks themselves of Auschwitz will testify against the people. That the place itself cries out. That the place itself would have some tangible presence of evil associated with it. A huge chunk of people in this population would say yes. The question is, would they be right? Now, to my wife, it'd be non-negotiably true. She couldn't get anywhere near the place. She wouldn't be able to get anywhere near the place. But if you just reduce it down in the Elvis Presley guitar thing, it's the same idea. Whether you think there would be a literally tangible presence of evil, or it's just the spiritual, I don't even know what is in essence articulated going on with the Elvis Presley guitar. It's just the association with the greatness of Elvis Presley that we sort of presuppose or just sort of intuitively connect to the actual tangible guitar as if it's somehow rubbed off on it. Now that's an entirely spiritual idea. Like I said, the difference between Auschwitz and another village in Poland would be material identical. But a lot of people go and visit Auschwitz. Why? To make communion with that, to somehow try to process and understand radical evil. Something by a lot of people probably make pilgrimages. If you're Jewish, my wife, by the way, is half Jewish. If you're Jewish, Christian by belief, but Jewish by, if you are Jewish, I'm sure there are a lot of Jewish groups that probably make pilgrimages to Auschwitz. Why? To try and process, to try and understand, to try and grapple with the radical evil that was displayed there. Now that's entirely a spiritual thing. That's a spiritual thing that atheists have been trying to convince us for the last 20 years is to some degree irrational. It's deeply rational. It's deeply rational. That's my point. That's the whole reason I'm making the video. The Elvis Presley guitar valuation is not irrational in the slightest. It's deeply rational. Why? It'd be done by every single person in our society, except for a handful of, really, really atheists. So there's something to consider there, something really deeply important. It's not irrational at all. It's not irrational at all. It's possibly the deepest part of being a human being, connected to something in essence in a way that is materially intangible. You understand how that would be completely materially intangible, right? There are the buildings in Auschwitz probably look and feel, and they're designed a certain way that is indistinguishable from another village nearby. Well, I mean, it'd be distinct because they designed Auschwitz specifically to process death. But materially, Auschwitz would be no different from anywhere else in Poland. But there are people who go there to this day to try and make communion, to try and process emotionally, grapple with the radical evil that took place there. And then there are people who probably say that there's a tangible presence of radical evil that lingers over the place to this day. Now, that may be debatable, but the other part isn't debatable. There are people who would say the Elvis Presley guitar could probably grant you powers to write songs. That would be debatable, probably not. But the fact that there is something materially different about Elvis Presley's guitar versus the same guitar not owned by Elvis Presley is inarguable. And it is deeply rational to some degree because every single solitary person in our society would see it that way, would value it differently. Everyone. So there's something here. There's some real, potentially game-changing argument to be made along these lines about the essence of spirituality and the tangibility and how things, ultimately the problem, the project of reductionist, materialist, naturalist is ultimately failed. Why? Because it couldn't possibly account for what the difference in the Elvis Presley guitar is at all. According to materialist, reductionist, naturalist, there is no difference at all. Why? Materially, it's indistinguishable from any other guitar. And yet everybody knows it's different. Knows it's different. That's the point. If everybody agrees on something, we know it. It's different. We value it differently, a lot differently. I didn't say $50 versus $500. If I did, then atheists could make an argument in favor of reductionist, materialist type arguments. I said $50 versus $50,000, which is an astronomical difference. And it's the truth. It's how everybody would value it. Look it up right now. I'm guessing somewhere between $50,000 and $300,000, which is an astronomical difference in most people's minds. And yet not reducible to material properties at all. Not even a little. It's a totally spiritual thing, guys. Totally spiritual thing, exactly the way the Bible describes it. Exactly the way, identical to how the Bible describes it. Evidence of things not seen. Ditto for Auschwitz. What you would experience there would be some sort of deep communion with what? With radical evil. Why would it happen? Evidence of things not seen. Evidence of things not seen. Period. There is a spiritual dimension to reality. The atheist can try to reduce it as much as he wants. It ain't going away. That's why atheism isn't going to grow past a certain subset of the population. 20% is probably where it'll top out, and that will be it. Why? Because everybody else sees that spiritual side of life. The atheists are the only one busy trying to pretend, trying to write it out of existence. Why? Not sure, actually. I get it to some degree why some people don't believe in God. As I've said, I'm not talking about an argument for God necessarily. You cannot believe in God and still understand everything I just said really clearly and agree with everything I just said. Why? Because everything I just told you is God's honest truth. Whether you believe in God or not. I can tell you anything false. I told you that there is a real argument to be made there for the spiritual component of life, and that is a fact. Why? Because the guitar materially is not different from any other Fender Strat or what did Elvis play? I don't remember. From any other mass-produced guitar owned by anybody else, produced off the assembly line, same year. It is material indistinguishable. And yet every single solitary person in our society knows that there's a big difference. What is that difference? Some sort of spiritual component to the guitar. Something different. The essence of things not seen. The evidence of things not seen. So, there's a really good argument to be made along those lines, and they will be coming down the pike. But actually, it's the argument that Peterson made in his Logos Ephesus is very, very similar. He was making a very similar point to the one I just made in the video. So, there you have it, kids. Just a little food for thought. You know, if you want to give me the tithes based off of that little video, be my guest. I will collect the tithes. No judgments. No judgments. I won't even tell anybody. I won't mention your name of which atheist started tithing to me first. You'll be the first on the block to have supported the Craig Reed ministry. I'm proud of that achievement. So there you have it, kids. That is all for now. Mass is ended. Go in peace. Amen.